SciTech Nutrition. Premium quality products. State-of-the-art look. Uncompromised ingredient quality. Our products work and taste good. www.scitechnutrition.com.
Welcome back to Live With, brought to you by SciTech Nutrition. Visit scitechnutrition.com. I'm your host, Dave Palumbo, and tonight we have a very special guest, a pioneer in bodybuilding radio. His Pro Bodybuilding Weekly podcast kind of ushered in the era of bodybuilding podcasts, for that matter, and it's still in continuation today. He's progressed and evolved and developed a new website known as Digital Muscle, as well as he'll be live streaming the Arnold Classic coming up in less than 4 weeks. And it's my honor to bring to you tonight a rival of mine and now an ally, I guess you could say, of sorts, Dan Solomon.
David, thank you for having me. For starters, congratulations. I was told that we are, at the rxmuscle.com 7-year anniversary. So congrats to you and your team for that. And I'd be remiss if I didn't give a very heartfelt congrats to you and Amanda on the birth of your son, which is very exciting, which begs the question, Dave, how are you looking so well rested at this point? I'd have to almost talk to Amanda and wonder, are you pulling your weight at night? Because I'd hate to think that you're doing all the sleeping and she's up every hour taking care of the baby. I hope that's not happening.
It's just good Italian genes, that's all it is. But I will say one thing. Amanda is doing a hell of a lot more at night than I am. I will take full responsibility for that. I'm more of a diaper changer. She likes to feed the baby. So we've divvied up our duties. I always think, my dad said right from the beginning the woman always does more. And Amanda got mad when he said that originally. And I think now she's realizing it just happens. The motherly instincts just take over. And especially with a boy. Boys love their mom.
I always joke that, when my son turned 2 years old, I walked down the hall and I introduced myself to him, which I think to some extent is true for all dads, because let's face it, in those early stages, it's definitely the mom's time. We try to do what we can. We try to make ourselves useful, but it's definitely the sweet spot for the mom. There's no question.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. Dan, let's start right from the beginning, because a lot of people in our industry, I know you and people behind the scenes know you, but you are a guy that likes to stay kind of behind the scenes in that sense that, probably if a person ran into you maybe at a show, they may not know who you are. How did you get involved in the bodybuilding industry to begin with? Did you ever want to, be an Olympia contender like all these other guys, or because you kind of approached it from a different angle?
Yeah, that's a good question. So always was, like so many others, a fan of the sport. In 1998, I was on a business trip in New York City, and I was staying at a hotel right across the street from the Paramount Theater at the Madison Square Garden, which of course was the host venue for the 1998 Mr. Olympia. So I decided to make a few phone calls and get some tickets to the event. And I went across the street and I attended the 98 Olympia. That, of course, was the night that Dorian announced his retirement before the show. Ronnie pulls off the upset over Flex, and the late Nasser El Sambadi wins the show. And I absolutely caught the bug. I was so enamored by the energy, the stage production, just the whole experience. I had been to many local level amateur NPC shows, but man, I'll tell you, that experience in 98, that was, of course, the last time the event was not held in Las Vegas. So the event ends, and then shortly thereafter, there was a little post-Olympia gala. Back in those days, the gala isn't like what it is today. Of course, Robin Chang and the AMI crew have turned it into something extraordinary. Back then, it was a little smaller. There was a room with 100 or so people in it, and I was in that room, and I met a guy who actually, ironically, was your guest on this show last week, Darren Charles.
We're having a little difficulty here. Let's see if we can get Dan back. It's interesting because Dan, I didn't even know that Dan was at the 98 Olympia in New York City. I was working with Metrics at the time, and we were promoting I guess you could say, the release of Peak Training Journal, which I was actually on the cover of. A lot of people don't know that. It was the last issue they ever printed, I think, and it wasn't really widely released. And I have about 20 copies here. That's my claim to fame. That was the only cover I was ever on. But do we have Dan back, Johnny? No, not yet. All right. Well, you know what? Why don't we cut to a quick break, Johnny? Why don't you run some commercials for our great sponsor, SciTech Nutrition, who's covering all our coverage of the Arnold weekend, both in the USA, in Brazil, and in Australia. All the lead-up interviews, including this interview, which, by the way, I can't believe we lost Dan because I've been dying to interview Dan. I think this might be the first interview Dan's ever done with anyone else. So, guys, stay tuned. We're going to hit a commercial break. When we come back, we should have Dan Solomon back. Guys, we're back. We fixed the little bit of technical difficulty we had. And Dan, you were telling us about how you met Darren Charles at that 98 Olympia weekend. Continue, please.
Yeah, so Darren and I get to talking. Turns out we only live a few minutes from each other in South Florida. We swapped information. I go back home, and as it turns out, Darren became my trainer for a number of years, and then one night he and his wife at the time invited me to their home and talked to me about Darren's desires to get some opportunities on the business side of bodybuilding. They knew I had a bit of a background in the business side, and they asked me if I would represent Darren and do what I could to try to create opportunities for him, and we were able to get him some endorsement deals, and that's kind of how that went. And then a couple years after that, of course, through that process, I managed to form a few relationships along the way. And then a guy named Richard Enla, who owned a company called Physical TV, decided to put the Mr. Olympia contest on pay-per-view. This goes back to like 01, 02. And he was looking for somebody to host the pay-per-view. Now, I guess there weren't a lot of candidates in the list, and we had a mutual friend by the name of Kelly Ryan. Kelly Ryan introduced me to Richard. Richard ended up hiring me to be a part of that. Of course, back in those days, if you remember, Joe Amato and those guys were involved in that. So Kelly Ryan introduced me to Richard, and then I started doing the hosting thing. But really, when you connect the dots all the way back, for me, it starts with a conversation with Darren Charles shortly after the 1998 Mr. Olympia.
That's how I didn't even know that story, to be honest with you. And luckily, you didn't continue to be friends with Kelly Ryan too much longer, because you might have wound up behind bars with her and her husband, Craig Titus. Now, where did the idea, Dan, come from to do a bodybuilding podcast? Because no one ever did it. No one had even thought of it. It really was kind of hard to do back in the early 2000s. It wasn't like it is today. You just kind of, everyone who has a Skype account can do a podcast. Where did this idea come from, and how did you actually make it, come into play?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it was 2004-ish, and I'm driving around in my car. I live down in South Florida. The Miami Heat had, I think, just acquired Shaquille O'Neal to play basketball for the Heat. And I only mention that because I was listening on the radio to Shaq give an interview on talk radio. And I thought to myself, what a shame it is that bodybuilding fans at that time didn't have the opportunity to hear the voices of their favorite bodybuilders. And, we take it for granted now because, as you just pointed out, there's such a saturation and there's so much available content. But back in those days, people hadn't heard the voice of, a Nasser or a Sean Ray or a Kevin or a Dorian. They didn't hear their voices unless they were fortunate enough to attend an event they never got to hear the voices of their favorite bodybuilding stars. So I made some calls, and I figured out back in that time there was all sorts of new technologies coming out. So I did a deal that would enable us to do a web-based program. Obviously, there's nothing local market about bodybuilding media, so you have to be able to deliver it to the world. And so we figured out a platform to do that on. I made a few phone calls. My first call, believe it or not, was actually to Sean Ray. Sean Ray and I were pretty close at the time. Sean Ray was about to have his first baby, Asia. And so he was kind of busy. He didn't want to really commit. And then my second phone call was to Bob Ciccarello, who's become one of my really close friends, as you know. Bob Ciccarello said, let's do it. And next thing you know it, June 13th, 2005, I think, we're on the air. And Dexter Jackson was our very first guest. And back in those days, Dave, we were actually able to break stories and we were able to deliver the news. Nowadays, everybody takes to their social media accounts to break stories, and it's a whole different game, unfortunately. But while there's a lot of great things about social media and the way the world is today, I definitely miss those days when we could we could have a bigger impact with what we did in terms of being able to break stories. The big story that night for Dexter was Dexter announced on our first show that he was not going to be doing that year's Olympia. And at that time, that was a big story. These days, we don't get to make those announcements. They take to their Twitter account and they blast it for the whole world to see. But that's the way it was.
You're right. The world of radio, podcasting has really changed because of social media, and the whole world of how we report on bodybuilding has evolved, even from the way back in, like you said, the mid-2000s when we started doing the coverage online. It's completely changed now. Message boards and forums are not as important as they used to be. I mean, I remember Chad had that Muscle Mayhem forum that was huge, and it kind of died off, because everyone is using, Facebook now, quite frankly, Twitter, Instagram. But back in those days when you first started the radio show, of course, I had gotten the job as the editor-in-chief of musculardevelopment.com, and I developed that website for Steve Bleckman. And Steve, of course, wanted to have a radio show because Dan Solomon had a radio show, who, by the way, at that time, Steve, you were like his biggest nemesis because, Steve always likes to be on the cutting edge of doing things. And John Romano and I had that radio show called No Bull Radio on Muscular Development. And Steve used to go crazy trying to outdo you. His whole thing was, we got to do better than Solomon. And I remember at the time just when we started vying for guests, and you were a very ruthless radio host and businessman because you wanted those guys first. You wanted to be able to break the stories first. Bring us back to that point in time and tell us, now I want to hear your version of the story, what was going on at that time in your mind and how you were, setting up your shows and picking your topics for that matter.
It's funny. Obviously, one advantage that I had was all I did was the radio show. Steve is a multifaceted media outlet with a and at that time, obviously a very successful magazine and multiple magazines. And the radio show was just sort of an extension of the MD brand. So all I focused on was doing a radio show. And at that time, I had a little bit more autonomy, I think. MD, of course, back in those days, I always call it the magazine war days when Flex and MD hated each other. And it was just nasty. And it was crazy how intense it had gotten for a time. And I was kind of the Switzerland guy, sort of in the middle, that I just kind of did my own thing and I didn't get wrapped up. MD had their team of athletes and Flex had their team of athletes. And then there was a lot of guys who were unsigned. But as it turned out, I forged a more meaningful relationship with the Weider side. And Peter McGuff brought me aboard over there and we started to do that. But it was just definitely a different time. And I will tell you this, and we'd be remiss if we didn't mention our colleague Larry Pepe, who I know is a big part of that for you guys back in those days. But you mentioned John Romano. I got to tell you, man, I was listening to you guys do your radio show, you and Romano, the other day. And Romano, I think it's a disgrace that John Romano is not making $5 million a year doing a nationally syndicated radio show. I can't stop listening to that guy. When you guys have him on and he's your that guy is so freaking talented as a writer and as a communicator. I don't agree with a lot of the stuff he says, but I can't turn him off. I can't stop listening to him. So I'll give some props to Romano. But man, that was just a different time back then, and it was nasty. And I think we were all just kind of wired to just battle. It was just a constant trying to outmaneuver the next guy. And on some level, that whole competitive spirit, for the most part, has kind of died off. And that's good because it's a little bit easier and less stressful. But I do think it kept us all on our toes, and it probably made us a little bit better and a little sharper back in those days. So those are my memories.
Absolutely. I remember. Pretty much, just for those people who don't remember those days, Dan pretty much outmaneuvered Bleckman almost every single time to get who you wanted. There was one interview I know that you wanted to get that you never got. It was with Tom Platz, and Steve Bleckman probably gave the guy $1 million, with advertising and deals here and there and promotions to get him to be interviewed. And I remember interviewing Tom on that radio show, and Steve felt like he won the Super Bowl that week that we had Tom Platz, and Dan Solomon did not. I'll never forget that. And I'm sure you probably remember that whole thing too, because Tom had a wife that you had to kind of deal with it, and he still has a wife, Cha, and you had to talk to both of them, and it was a very complicated fiasco trying to get him committed to doing the show. I think it took us like 6 weeks to get him on, but it was a
funny part about it is now, just as evidence to how things have changed, I don't even think anybody aspires for exclusivity anymore. It's not even realistic. It's like when you go to a concert, they don't even tell you to put away your cameras anymore, right? Because you just can't control it. Everybody's going to pick up their phone and they're going to video everything. It's just gotten to a place where you just can't manage it anymore. All you want to do is provide quality content to the viewers, and we all try to give something different. Speaking of that, though, Dave, I have to comment on something. I'm actually wearing my lucky hat today. This is an old school vintage IFBB logo hat. It was actually given to me by Ben Weeder. I mention this because I wore it today, because today's a very special day, and I'm going to tell you why. It's special because I was thinking that prior to this interview, let's face it, you and I have been at this for close to 2 decades each. So collectively, we probably have about a combined, emphasis on combined, 35 to 40 years of doing the business of bodybuilding media. You, of course, were kicking ass on stage long before that. But in the business of bodybuilding media, we got about a combined 35 to 40 years. If you add it all up, we've probably interviewed roughly about 1,000 or so people, I would guess. If you put it all together, you've probably interviewed more people than I have because you work harder than I do. But today, this interview marks the very first time that you and I are doing anything of any kind together. So for that, I wore my lucky hat to commemorate this historic moment. And I don't think that should be lost in the shuffle, because that's kind of crazy when you think two guys that do what we do and have done it for as long as we have. Today's the first day. So I'm grateful for the invite. And I just thought I'd put that out there for the viewers, because I don't know if people fully appreciate how strange it is that you and I have never done anything together except pose for a couple pictures over the years.
Well, I think you've had me on the radio show on your radio show in the past, I think once or twice. But I never got to interview you. I don't think has anyone ever interviewed you for any bodybuilding related show at all?
I hate it. I'm a believer. Joe Weider always used to say, and Peter McGuff too, always says, it's about the sport. It's about the athletes. I really feel that way. I think their stories are the interesting ones. I live a real simple life. I got to be honest with you. When we finish up here in about 20 minutes, I'm going to be coaching 12 9-year-olds on a Little League baseball field. That's what I do. I keep it simple. Every day I get up and I figure out what I could do in the bodybuilding world to try to create new opportunities and new projects and all that. But I got to be honest, I've never really seen myself as an interesting interview. So I just always say no. I say, go interview somebody else. I've just never really wanted to get started doing it. I like asking the questions. I got to be honest with you, I'm a little intimidated by the fact that you have all the power here. You get to ask all the questions. So I guess agreeing to be interviewed by Dave Palumbo is like somebody being scared of heights, skydiving.
After this, you won't be afraid anymore. So I'll make you a better interview. Let's talk about some of your interviews that you've had over the year, because I might have done more interviews than you. You had, I think, a lot higher echelon of interviewee. For whatever reason, I think you're a little more politically correct than I am. Probably that's why. It's like what's his name? Frank Sinatra never wanted to be interviewed by anyone because he never wanted the hard questions. So he would always go on Larry King, because he knew Larry King would always protect him. I don't protect my interviewees, so maybe people are a little more nervous with me. But You have interviewed Arnold Schwarzenegger, a guy who I've always wanted to interview. I only got him at the buffet once with a meatball in his mouth, and I really didn't get much out of him. But you've interviewed him on Pro Bodybuilding Weekly. I listened to the interview. It was a great interview. Talk to me about that. Were you nervous before that interview? Were you afraid that, man, if I ask the wrong question, or maybe if I screw up, I'm gonna mess up my, what were you feeling inside of yourself prior to that interview?
Your buffet line interview with Arnold was one of the great moments in the annals of bodybuilding media history, by the way. But to answer your question, I was petrified. I actually got a phone call from Peter McGuff. By the way, I mentioned Peter McGuff, and I just hope everybody's thinking about Peter. Peter's had a really tough year, as a lot of people know. He texted me yesterday. It sounds like he's starting to get his strength back a little bit, but hopefully everybody's thoughts and prayers are with Peter and Ann and their family, and let's get him back in the mix as quickly as possible. To answer your question, though, yeah, so Peter calls me and he says, Dan, in about 2 hours, I have Arnold Schwarzenegger available for you to interview him. And I was shaking. I'll be honest with you. I was shaking. I ran to my office and I put together some questions and I lined up Bob and Bob Ciccarello, and we ended up doing the interview. And I still remember how nervous I was. I even remember those initial moments when Arnold, there was about 4 or 5 minutes before we started recording. I think it might have even been live, but before we started doing the actual interview, there was 4 or 5 minutes. And I remember the conversation. Bob and his wife, Tasha, had just given birth to their daughter, Melania. And I still remember like it was yesterday, Arnold informing, or Bob informing Arnold that his daughter was born in the Maria Shriver wing of that hospital. And Arnold got a kick out of that. Anyways, we ended up doing it. And man, I'll tell you, it was a big deal. That was also at a time when Arnold was a little less available than he is today. It seems like Arnold's more obtainable, more gettable. He's available. He's doing all sorts of different things. Social media, the world has changed so much in terms of access. Back then, it was really, really hard to get a hold of Arnold, and I'll forever be in Peter's debt for having put that together for us. But where it gets really nerve-wracking is on the webcast, because on the webcast, he walks over to you, and I've had the good fortune of doing that a few times. And as you know, Dave, you've interviewed a lot of people. When you interview somebody on camera, you're inches away from them. It's not normal human separation. Your face is like 4 inches from their chin. So the first time Arnold gets brought over to me, he walks over and he says, "Hi, Dan," and "Hi, Bob." And to this day, I still don't know how he knew who I was or who Bob was. I think he's got an advisor in his ear that tells him who these guys are, and it makes us feel really important when he does it. But he walks over, we do the interview, and of course, you're on camera now, so you're trying not to sweat, you're trying not to shake, you're trying not to ask him questions that he's been asked 1,000 times before. The microphone is up against his mouth, and you're trying your best not to let the viewer see your hand shake with the microphone in front of him because you're so petrified and so nervous. Fortunately, I've calmed down a little bit. I've done it a number of times now, or it's a little bit of an easier experience, but it never gets old. And I take the responsibility of interviewing Arnold seriously because he seems to have a level of trust and a level of comfort. So, but yeah, man, it's a cool thing, and I'm hopeful we can arrange for you at some point to get in front of Arnold, because I would just venture to guess that your questions to Arnold would probably be a little different than what I would ask him.
Absolutely. I will say one thing. I did interview Maria Shriver. I got her backstage one year at the Arnold when they were still together, Arnold and her, and I got her for about 60 seconds of interview. And to me, that was my my Arnold interview. Okay, that was as close as I've come. Let's talk about the Arnold interview had to be a little I guess you could say conservative, because you had to be careful what you asked him. What was your most enjoyable interview? The interview that you say, you know what, this goes down as my best interview that I ever did.
That's yeah, man, that's something. So the interviews to me that stand out over all of them are when you get the opportunity to interview guys that unfortunately today are no longer with us. I had an unbelievable interview. I'll never forget it, with Mike Matarazzo, Serge Nubret, Joe Weider, Ben Weider. But the one that stands above all of those is an interview that I did back in 2007. And it was an interview with the legendary multi-Mr. Universe, former Hercules, the iconic Reg Park. And the reason that was so special for me is because that interview was arranged at a time when Reg was very sick. And we knew that the purpose of this interview was so that he could have a final opportunity to communicate with bodybuilding fans, with the people that have supported him for so long. And we were able to put the interview together. And what made this interview so different, the other names that I mentioned, of course, we didn't know that they were dying in those cases. I didn't know Joe and Ben Weider were dying. And of course, the Mike Matarazzo interview, he was actually doing pretty good at the time. The Reg Park interview, we knew Reg was dying while we were doing the interview. We knew he had a very short time left to live. So as the interview is going on, there's this real sense of responsibility to make sure that he's able to say the things that he wants to say to the fans and to the listeners. And I'll never forget how nervous I was to make sure that Serge, in what would probably be his final interview ever, was given the chance to say the things that he wanted to say. And it was a moving interview, and it was so poignant and so personal and so special. And he said some things that I would encourage everyone to go listen to it. And when the interview ended, he wished everyone well, and he said some very emotional things. And I still remember it to this day. The interview ends. I turned off all my broadcast equipment, and even as I'm thinking about it, I get a little emotional. I turned off my broadcast equipment, and I sat in my little office at the time where I recorded the show. By myself, and there was tears streaming down my face because I knew what was happening. I knew that was probably the last time any of us would hear from Reg. As it turned out, about 2.5 or so months later, he ended up dying, and that was intense, man. That was an intense thing. And a lot of times, Dave, we talk about we interview guys, and and it all seems so superficial and silly and all that, but these interviews, in certain cases, they're special. They're legacies. They're opportunities to give someone's voice life forever. And in that case of the Reg Park interview, man, that was a powerful experience. And I wouldn't trade 100 Arnold interviews for that interview with Reg Park, because that was a pretty cool thing to do.
It is interesting when you interview people sometimes to look back, years later at how impactful that interview actually was, because you don't know. I mean, I remember when I interviewed Vince Comerford a year before he died, and he said, he had told us stories about how he had tried to make a comeback in bodybuilding, and he had a heart attack, and then it happened twice, and now he was back again, and he was going to try to compete. And I said, I even said to him, I said, it sounds like that might not be a good idea, for your health. And he said, no, it's fine. And then a year later he died, and I went back and I listened to that. I remember Johnny pulled that interview up and we put it up, and it was almost like prophetic. It was weird. It was scary, but you can see the passion that he exhibited for the sport that he loved. And I think that's what you got from Reg. He was so passionate about what he did that he, even knowing he was dying, he wanted to get that last word out to the audience. And I think Arnold, who's Reg Park was his big hero, is like that. I think Arnold realizes now he's getting a little older, and he really wants to give back to the bodybuilding community, more so now that he's older than he did, I think, during his middle years. Wouldn't you say? There's
no question. Look, let's not dismiss the fact that it would have been easy for him to just do this Columbus thing every year. That's larger than what they say. It's in terms of athlete participation and number of sports, it's larger than the Summer Olympics. But the reality is, he, along with Jim Lorimer and Bob Lorimer, they expanded to 6 continents. And it's easy to sit there and say they expanded to 6 continents. It's all a money grab. But he's got to get on a plane now, 6 times a year and fly to different continents. And a lot of them are really close together. Australia is 2 weeks after Columbus, and then of course, the South Africa's on there, and China, and Rio. These are long trips he has to take. So, and I'm sure I'm sure financially it's a good play for him. But look, it really, there's other ways Arnold can make money, and the fact that he's willing to attach himself to a 6-continent bodybuilding and fitness venture, I think that says everything about where he's at in terms of his connection to the sport.
100% right on that note. I want to take a quick commercial break. I know we have our SciTech Nutrition is our sponsor of all our coverage leading up to the Arnold, and all 3 Arnolds that Dan just made notice of: USA, Australia, and Brazil. So we're going to step aside for 30 seconds. When we come back, more with Dan Solomon. we're back with I'm Dave Palumbo, and we're talking with Dan Solomon, the former host of Pro Bodybuilding Weekly. And we're going to get to find out why that is in a minute. But Dan, I want to get back to the years when, in your heyday, obviously when Pro Bodybuilding Weekly was the place to go and the radio show to listen to. Not that it isn't today, but it was a more important show back then because there was no social media really. As the years progressed, your relationship with bodybuilding.com and Flex magazine, AMI, kind of started to deteriorate. And at some point, you decided to make the move over to muscular development. Ironically enough, the guy that you were in competition with earlier in the 2000s. Talk to me about how that relationship came about.
Yeah, and just to circle back, I don't think it's so much of those relationships deteriorated. Bodybuilding.com kind of went down a different road in terms of they graduated to a place of covering all sorts of things, and the time when bodybuilding was the center of their universe had changed, so it wasn't really an ideal home at that point for what we were trying to do, and of course, a lot of things changed on the media side. So so the MD relationship was actually pretty timely because at that time, I was looking for an opportunity to I've always tried to create new alliances with entities that could potentially introduce PBW or really anything that I'm working on to a new corner of the fan base. And let's face it, Flex and AMI and Muscle and Fitness, they have their own corner of the industry, and MD has its own corner. You guys have your corner, and there seems to be the pie seems to be big enough to go around, and everybody's making a living, which is great. But for me, I hadn't really done anything with Steve. Steve at that time was in the process of really making a big surge to try to. He had just kind of committed to this. Multimedia destination approach, and obviously PBW is sort of the embodiment of multimedia to some extent. So it just seemed like a natural fit. We had a conversation, and one thing that we've learned, Dave, is that you just never know how things are going to play out. Let's face it, there was no bigger rivalry than Peter McGuff and Steve Bleckman, right? I mean, those guys didn't like each other at all, and now Peter McGuff is, of course, the senior editor of Steve's magazine. This industry is small. These bridges, you got to keep them intact, and you just never know. One second, some guy's posting on a message board. Next second, he's running a major. He or she are running a major media outlet. So it's just kind of a funny thing, and that's how it got started with Steve. And then shortly thereafter, he made me his senior features editor. I was actually kind of interested in getting more involved on the magazine side. My education and background is in journalism. I'm a writer by trade. So for me personally, the idea to be connected to the magazine side of it, even though people will argue that, magazines are fading and so forth, and that's fine. But to me, I've always had a soft spot for magazines and for print and for writing. So for me, it was a chance to do a little of that with a magazine and find a good home for PBW. And it was just a good fit at the time.
And, at the time, your host of the show was Lee Thompson. And obviously, we all know where that went. Lee Thompson went from being the NPC district chairman of Texas, the state of Texas, building that state up to a, huge, I guess you could say, entity. And just last year, this past Olympia, decided he was going to break off and start his own organization, whatever that, comes about. I haven't heard anything about that recently, by the way. Was that a big shock to you? Because you were kind of friendly with Lee Thompson. You were his co-host. You spoke to him frequently. Was it a shock when you found out what went on with Lee?
It was a big shock for all of us. I mean, I met Lee Thompson back in 2006. We were actually we were in Denver at the 2006 Colorado Pro Show. That was the event that Sean Ray was putting on. He had Bob Chick and I come out and do this on-stage hosting thing. I don't know, were you there?
At that show.
Okay, that was Phil Heath's pro debut, and so we were all there that night, and Sean Ray actually introduced Lee to all of us, and we all became fast friends. It was actually fun. For a number of years, we were all traveling together. I used to travel a lot more back then, and our families got to know each other, and so you go through this process and you become real close with everybody. I mean, Lee was close with a number of people, and then there was a time we brought Lee in because Bob Chick and I stopped hosting PBW together. So I wanted somebody who was really on the inside, on the inner circle of the IFBB and the NPC, and so I reached out to Lee and I told him, I asked him if he wanted to be a co-host on the show to kind of give us that, insider perspective on the rule changes and all the things that go on in the organization. And he accepted, and he ended up hosting with us for a number of years. But yeah, to answer your question, it was shocking. I mean, it would be shocking for anybody. It was especially shocking for those of us who of course, Chad Nichols and I, we co-hosted with him, and we were shocked. He actually called me right around that time when the announcement came out, yeah, I was taken aback because there was nobody who was more loyal to the NPC and the IFBB at that time than Lee. So when you hear somebody like that who had been so close to all of that for so long, and then suddenly he was moving in a different direction, it shocks you. But, I guess as we've learned in the world in and out of bodybuilding, we should always expect the unexpected, right? Because people, change companies all the time and things happen. But yeah, it was definitely a shocker for sure.
Was it difficult to have a judge as your co-host? Because you almost, he judges almost all the big shows. He was all over, Europe and all the international events. You almost can't. How are you going to call out the guy and say, "Hey, I didn't agree with the decision you made"? It had to be awkward because it kind of put you in a position where he's my co-host, but at the same time, should I call him out if he's making bad decisions?
Out there talking about the way a contest went, I always thought it's added value for the listener to be able to hear what they were talking about at the table, what the judges actually thought, what they saw. Hearing from the actual judges, I always thought was a perspective that the audience deserved. So that was always my take. That's why I always loved, having Big Steve Weinberger on the show, and guys who are in the trenches and have the opportunity to provide insight. Jim Mannion's been on the program many times, and for me, it's a treat to be able to talk to these guys and to have that information that comes from the highest level passed along to the listeners. I always thought that's what sort of made PBW a little different, because everybody else was sort of talking and stirring the pot and creating great entertainment and great listening value. And I always thought our role was we weren't so much people who had sources. We were the source, right? So that was sort of the way we positioned ourselves. So, but yeah, you make a valid point. People could criticize that, but I always liked presenting the views straight from the judges' table.
You think, just to get back to Steve Weinberger never made I don't think he's ever made a bad decision in my mind on when he's judging. Lee had a lot of controversial decisions, so it wasn't really equal, 1-to-1. But I want to just ask you another question on Lee, and then we'll move on to the next topic. Why do you think he left? I mean, because you knew him better than anyone. Why would he pick up and move or try to start a new organization when he knew very well that he was well seated with the one that he had?
You make a couple of good points. All right, so I think in Lee's DNA, he is one of these guys that always wants more. Certain people are wired that way. It's never enough. I mean, let's be honest. The state of Texas real estate in the NPC is very, very valuable. It's one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in our industry, the NPC Texas real estate. It's incredibly valuable. There's a ton of athletes over there. Their contests are well attended. The bodybuilders and the fitness competitors and the bikini competitors, physique and figure, there's tremendous talent over there. It's an incredible, like I always say, it's sort of like NPC Texas real estate. It's like a piece of beautiful beach in Maui, right next to the nicest hotel on the island. Like every chairman would want to have the keys to that kingdom, right? So for somebody like you or me or a lot of the people who are watching who are more conventional in their thinking, would be thrilled to have the state of Texas under their watch and to be able to enjoy the fruits of having the state of Texas and all those contests every couple weekends, having a new show, one's bigger than the next. Yeah, it was hard to believe, hard to believe that he wouldn't want to continue doing that. But Lee, I think throughout his whole life and anything that he's ever done is just a guy that it's just never enough. He just always wants more. And I think deep down, Bob and I always kind of thought, I know Bob had this inclination, I think even more so than I, so I shouldn't even take credit for it, that at some point he was going to want to have his own thing and he was going to want to do something bigger and, or at least in his mind bigger, and try to go ahead and create something. Yeah, I think at the core of all of this is a man who just simply wanted to do something or tried to do something bigger. And but I'll tell you right now, there's a lot of promoters and a lot of chairmen in the NPC and around the country and around the world that would kill to have the state of Texas to run. And of course now Ed and Betty Parisa are doing that, and they're off to a good start. But it's definitely it's one that's it's a head scratcher. But I'm not going to try to understand it. I'm not going to try to relate, because I don't think that way. I can't even pretend to understand why somebody would walk away from the state of Texas as the NPC chairman, but it was a decision he made.
Well, Dan, I always say that you're the best paid man in our industry. I jokingly say it every year, but it's true. I mean, you do 30 radio shows a year, and you probably make more money than anyone else. You probably have the highest profit.
I think you make more money than me, Dave. I got to be honest with you. You got a lot of stuff going on over there.
I don't think so. For the amount of work you put, if I put your 30 hours in a week and made your money, I'd be very happy. I would probably.
Come on.
But at some point, Steve Blackman and you this past couple months, even though we were breaking balls, Chris and I, on the radio show, we were actually right. You and him kind of dissolved your relationship, and you decided to move forward on your own. You created a website known as digitalmuscle.com, which is a blogosphere site, and you moved your radio show over there. Talk to me about how that came about and why all of a sudden was this the time to do that?
Yeah, and it was a tough decision, man. I'll tell you, because look, I know you guys enjoy beating up on Steve. I know that's something you guys enjoy doing. But I'll tell you, I was there for 4 years, and Steve always treated me fair. He really did. In fact, he did a couple things for me that I really enjoyed. For those people who have worked in the magazine business, you know how rare it is to have the total freedom to write about whatever you want to write about. And every month I would write a feature article and a column. And in my column, I would turn in, over the course of 4 years, so that would be 48 issues, I turned in 48 opinion pieces on whatever I wanted to, and he never kicked it back. He never told me I couldn't talk about that. So I was always grateful. I even mentioned your name, Dave, I think, in a few columns, and he never kicked it back. So for that, I was always grateful to have the freedom to write about what I wanted to. Steve and Elise, his wife, is a classy lady, as you know, and I always enjoyed visiting with her and the whole team over there. But I'll just be honest, it just became an exercise in redundancy. I was doing a lot of the same things over and over again, and I've been doing a lot of the same things over and over again for a long time, and I just got to a place where I wanted to do something different. And I had mentioned to Steve on many occasions that there's different things that I want to do, and I want to kind of mix it up a little bit, and life is short. My father passed away 6 years ago at 66 years old of pancreatic cancer, and it was kind of a reminder that who knows how much longer we have to do the things we want to do. And I know you're a student of Wayne Dyer, Dave, and I know you and I have had conversations about that on the side, and I take these years seriously, and I really think that we only have a certain amount of energy to spend on things, and I was just spending my energy on the same things redundantly, monotonously over and over again, and I had some ideas and things that I wanted to put into work, and so I just decided that I wanted to go ahead and move on. And but no, it wasn't a bad departure. Steve doesn't owe me any money. It's all good, and we just decided to move on. And digitalmuscle.com is a project that I thought would be fun. I always wanted to avoid the creation of a full functioning destination website, because I know how hard it is. You know more than anybody, Dave, how hard that is. You got a whole team over there, and
sure.
We talked earlier about your 7-year anniversary. I can appreciate how hard that is for you guys and what you guys do and what goes into the process of creating content and servicing advertisers and doing all the SEO work and the social media work and accruing talent and all that stuff. It's a lot of work, but it was a task that it just became time for me to take that on. And digitalmuscle.com is a little different. It's not a bodybuilding website, really, by any means. In fact, I always tell bodybuilding fans, if you're interested in hardcore competitive bodybuilding, RX Muscle, MD, you guys do it great. I'm not going to try to deliver what you guys deliver to the fans. I'm just doing something that's a little bit more of a sort of a multimedia blogosphere hybrid. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to get to know a lot of really talented, smart people who have done some really cool work. And the Dr. Doug Kalmans and the Chad Nichols and the Ben Pekulskis and the John Hansons and all these guys who are tied to the organization, Skip LaCour and Tad the diet coach. There's just Scott Ardella. The list is endless, and I could go on and on. But these are people that I just love, man. And I love what they have to say. And I wanted to provide a platform for really smart people with really cool thoughts and ideas and research and perspectives to be able to share it in a place that's high integrity and incredible. And it's very different than, you guys are having fun over there. I always say if somebody's out there and they want to have a good time, go hang out with Dave Palumbo. Hang out with me. It's not going to be nearly as fun, but I'm proud of what we're creating. Of course, the webcast deal that we just secured with the Arnold folks is a tremendous sort of.
I want to ask. Hold on. I want to ask you. So, I'm going to ask you about that in a second. I got to get back to Blackman, but because my fans would not. I have to ask you this question. Blackman has got to be going nuts. I'm going to tell you why. Because digital muscle that's his coin phrase. Digital. He created that word, I think. And digital muscle, DM, looking almost like muscular development, MD, is just too close for comfort. As a matter of fact, your coin phrase for digital muscle was the next big thing, which was a big Blackman expression. I see you've since changed that. You're telling me Steve doesn't have a problem with you doing digital muscle? You don't think he's like going crazy over there?
Look, I don't know if he's going crazy or not. My guess is that if he visited the website, which I'm sure he does every day, like he visits yours and so many others. My guess is upon arrival at digitalmuscle.com, he would realize that our two sites have very little in common. You're right, though. You make a good point. I actually opened it up as the next big thing in bodybuilding media because that's all I knew. And it's so funny how in this world, you sometimes don't know what something's going to be until you put it out in the universe. And I put it out in the universe and it just sort of took on a life of its own. And it's moved further and further away with each passing day from hardcore serious bodybuilding. And we actually just struck a deal. We're very excited. Ruth Silverman, she was actually, a lot of people don't know this, she was editor-in-chief at Flex Magazine. A lot of people don't know this, and longtime editor at Iron Man and columnist. She came over to Digital Muscle, and we're going to announce that today or tomorrow. She's going to be a managing editor and help us gather some great content and polish up what we're doing a little bit. And so we're just trying to bring really quality people to the forefront. But to your question, I don't know what Steve thinks. I will just say this about Steve. And this isn't so much a criticism as much as it is an observation, and I feel like I have an obligation to give you something because I know you're searching for something on Steve. But I'll just give you this. There's two schools of thought, I think, in the world of business. There is the collaborative spirit, people who like to collaborate and form strategic alliances and work together with their friends and figure out ways to expand their brand and all that sort of thing through meaningful relationships, sort of like what we're doing right now, right? You and I aren't in business together, but we're doing what we can to provide value for each other. So there's the collaborative school of thought, and then there's the isolationist school of thought. There's the folks who just can't find their way to figure out ways to do things with other entities. And not everybody is wired to do things that way. So I think at the end of the day, that's sort of what led to us Steve and I not being able to continue, because Steve is a guy who just likes to do things a certain way. He's got a very old school way of approaching business. And I don't know if something happened in his past. I don't know if something happened before I knew him that maybe something was taken from him, that he feels protective over things and doesn't have a level of trust. That's possible. But Steve definitely is not the synergy, collaborative type guy that certainly that I am, and that I think you need to be nowadays to grow, because let's face it, it's not as easy as it used to be. Unless you have a really big checkbook, unless you're willing to spend endless amounts of money to acquire the universe, you better be collaborative, right? You better engage other outlets and figure out strategic partnerships and relationships. That's how I feel, and that's kind of why I think in the end it just didn't work out. But I just think it's different approaches to business.
But Steve's got the big checkbook. That's why he can do that. You know, he's like the guy, the kid on the block who's got all the baseball cards. You know, and he wants them. He must be saying like, curse is foiled again, because he started out as your rival back in the rival again. So he must feel like I'm sure he's hurting over this one. I know he is. All right, let's get to the.
He might decide to call me his rival. I really don't know what we're competing for. I'm not trying to go out and get interviews with Dorian Yates, and that's not the model that I'm following. But if it gives him a competitive edge, or it gives him a reason to get going in the morning, to feel that there's rivals out there, then by all means, we all need our own fuel. And if that works for him, that's great. But I really don't see the parallels in what we're doing. But again, like I said, sometimes for some people, they actually become better versions of themselves. They perform at a higher level when they manufacture rivalries. And if that's what's happening, that's okay. He can do that.
With me for years with the rivalry that never existed. I'm a big believer like you are. I'm a believer in collaboration. I think that everyone should work together, and we should share interviews, and who cares? I think exclusivity is the stupidest thing in our industry, because it only hurts the athletes. Because the athletes want to have as much exposure as possible, because that's going to enable them to make money moving forward. Talking about exposure, you originally told me when you started Digital Muscle, you had no interest in doing contest coverage, and then an opportunity presented itself to you to be able to live stream or orchestrate or produce the live stream of the Arnold Classic USA this year. And I know you have some relationships you forged with that, and you're going to be presenting that on digitalmuscle.com. Tell me how that came about, the Reader's Digest version of that, and what can we expect come 4 weeks from today?
Yeah, so it was funny. You're right. It just kind of materialized. We put together a really interesting production team. Well, let me take a step back. So an opportunity was presented to me from a really talented collection of production guys, a lot of guys that you know, Jay Hammett and Tommy Roper and Patrick Rivera, Travis Chapman, who of course has been doing this for a very long time, Dr. Norma Kirby, Dr. Brittany Kirby. They have a great business in Atlanta called Nutrition House Atlanta. She has a great website called leantherapy.com. But I mentioned all of this stuff. So this contingency came to me, and I've known a number of them for years, and they wanted to figure out how we could create some more production opportunities. These guys are big on production. They like to do things really fun and really add a lot of gloss to the production and try to take things up a notch. And they asked me if there was any way to get involved in the game of doing webcasts for major events like the Olympia or the Arnold Classic. And I said, well, listen, I don't know. I know bodybuilding.com's done it for a long time, and they've done a great job. I've been a part of that for many years. And I just gave Bob Lorimer a call over at the Arnold offices, and I asked him if those rights were available, because I think I have the team where we can put it together and make this thing happen. And the rights were available, and we ended up putting the deal together. And for me, I just viewed it as an opportunity. See, I will say this. I've seen this debate go on lately on the forums. I think I may have seen it on your forum. It may have even been over at MD also, where people are talking about the viability of the webcast, right? That's a big topic right now. And it's funny because I feel a responsibility that bodybuilding fans need to be able to watch these events. Like, it's crazy to me. Anybody who wants to pose the argument that viewing a play-by-play thread is equally as valuable as the experience of watching a live TV-like experience on a screen of an event. So I'm committed to that. I'm committed to making sure that fans are always able to watch them. And people talk about ROI. I know, Dave, you love to joke about the term ROI. But the truth is, it's up to us to figure out ways. And Dave, I know you've been very good at this as well. It's up to us to figure out ways to create win-win type deals, so ROI is there for everybody involved. And people who will fire back and they'll say, oh, there's no ROI. Well, maybe if you look a little closer and you get a little creative and you figure out ways to bring the right people and the right resources together, you can do these productions and everybody can win, especially the fans who get to watch the event. So I'm proud that digitalmuscle.com is going to host this thing, and hopefully we'll be able to do it, for many years to come. I'm real proud of being a part of this year's Arnold Classic, because once you sort of do business with the Arnold people, you really realize you're a part of something pretty big, and being a part of the Arnold brand. And I flew out to Columbus a couple weeks ago and spent a couple days with Jim Lorimer and Bob Lorimer, and it was just a really cool experience because, Dave, sorry to ramble on this, but how we always talk about the absence of ever since the Weider offices closed in Woodland Hills, California, that was always kind of like the center of the bodybuilding world. Well, I always wondered where the center of the bodybuilding world was now. And I'll tell you, when I walked into that little office they have called Classic Productions, which is where they produce all the Arnold Classics, and I walked into their office and I sat in Jim Lorimer's office in the conference room and I saw all the posters. Remember, these guys were putting on events before the Arnold Classic. They put on Mr. Olympia contests and so forth. And when I saw the history in that office, and I talked to Jim Lorimer and I had him tell the story about, the time that he sat there and he watched Serge Nubret and Arnold, or not Serge Nubret, Sergio Oliva and Arnold compete. And it was just such great stories and such great, rich history. And to be a part of that and to be in that office with them, I think that trip made me discover like where the new center of the bodybuilding world is, because that office out there in Columbus, Ohio is definitely sort of a hub for where a lot of very important things in our industry are happening now.
All this time it was in my snake room, but I guess it's not. Well, Dan, it was really good catching up with you. I think the world, the bodybuilding world that is, really had very little to know about you and how you got started. And I think that, you're a major player behind the scenes in the bodybuilding world. Now, obviously, doing this Arnold Classic webcast. And you're right. I do a couple things with the Arnold Classic people. We live stream the Bodybuilding Hall of Fame, the International Hall of Fame, hosted by Dr. Bob Goldman every year. We've been doing it the last 3 years now. And we also do a live pregame show that the Arnold people are kind of, they condone that and they promote that on their website. And, they're very loyal. Once you show them that you can do a high-quality production and you're adding value to their show, they'll back you forever. So the fact that you were able to raise the money to do this webcast in the fashion that you're doing it is really admirable on my part, because I know how hard it is to get people to hand over cash to you. I only hope that this webcast will be able to be procured yearly for you, because I think it is great so the fans at home to be able to watch the show while we're commenting and we're doing our play-by-plays, and it makes them feel like they're part of it. And let's face it, TV is not as important as it was 10 years ago. The internet is much more important. Matter of fact, I don't watch cable TV anymore. Everything I watch is on my Apple TV box, whether it be YouTube or Netflix or the some of the cable stations apps that they put out there. And this is the future. We're forging the future now, and I can only hope that we can somehow set up a system, and I've said this before, I don't have to be involved with it, where all the shows can be webcast, and at some point there could be a centralized website where you can go and watch every show that's happening on a single weekend, flipping back and forth. Maybe at some point we could all make it happen together.
I think we're working towards that. I think that's in the future. And with the technology here in 2016, it's unacceptable if we're not able to put that together. So we'll definitely have to do that. And by the way, it's also going to feed out on the Roku boxes as well. So you mentioned Apple TV, so it'll give people a chance to actually experience it on television. My production guys are putting that together. So that's really exciting. I want to mention something before we close, though. Prejudging is, of course, on Saturday, I think afternoon, 1 or 2 o'clock Columbus time. And we're going to be sitting at a really nice booth in Columbus that these guys are setting up for us, Jay and the crew and Travis. And I know we're going to need probably one more really insightful commentator to lend some value to what we're doing with our Arnold Classic webcast and with the bodybuilding show. And I only know a few people that are actually capable of giving some really good perspective. So, Dave, if you know anyone, I might be interested in extending an invitation right here and now to join us for a little bit and provide some Palumbo-esque perspective on the lineup at the Arnold Classic. What do you think?
What's your ROI on that one?
I don't know if I can afford you. You're a big ticket item, but hopefully we can get you there.
Hey, if the invitation is open, I'll take you up on it. I'd love to add my 2 cents to the equation. You always got to have the guy who's politically incorrect on the panel, right?
Hey, as long as you promise to behave.
Wear a suit, I promise. Did we lose him on that one, Johnny? I think I put him out of business right there on that last comment. Well, you know what? This is the end of the episode anyway. Dan, I want to just thank you for coming on if you can still hear me, and thank you for that invitation. I will accept, so I will be on that pregame, or I should say prejudging panel there, and hopefully I'll be able to give some interesting insights into what I'm seeing up on the stage. I think it's going to be a great webcast, and like I said, I hope you can continue doing this for years to come. And thank you for joining us today. For now, though, we are out of time. Until next time, you've been watching Live With, sponsored by SciTech Nutrition. Check them out at scitechnutrition.com. We'll see you tomorrow. Evan Centopani.